Since we had a conversation about the protagonist, I think it's important we also have a conversation about the antagonist. I feel like a lot of literature in modern day tends to gloss over the details of a really good, in-depth antagonist and making sure that they have the same, goals and motivations like the protagonist does, but they just kind of work in conflict with one another. You really need to develop your antagonist about as much as you do your protagonist to make sure that they have the same amount of depth. And while the protagonist is the main character in your story and the plot revolves around them, the antagonist is kind of the catalyst for the conflict and the plot, kind of keeps that driving forward. The antagonist adds the depth, adds the drama, the conflict to the narrative of the story. And so there's different types of antagonists, it's just not the bad guy or the villain, although the villain is one of the categories of an antagonist. And the villain is probably the most well-known type of antagonist, where they have just evil intentions, malicious actions, and just direct opposition to the protagonist. This can be mostly seen whenever they have their personal motivations are typically power, revenge, greed, some sort of extreme. And classic cases, could be, Darth Vader or Emperor Palpatine from Star Wars, Lord Voldemort, the Joker from Batman. He wants chaos, just wants to see the world burn. So your villains are inherently usually have some sort of evil to them. Now, there's also the conflict creator, which they're not necessarily an evil, but they create obstacles. They are just in opposition of the protagonist. They don't agree. They're a source of conflict, though it may not necessarily be evil. It's just, different values, different ideologies, different goals. And so they tend to drive that plot forward as well. So it's really hard to think of ones that I was trying to think of some. For example, Tracy Flick in Election, not necessarily an evil character, but she causes a lot of turmoil and she butts heads with a lot of the other characters. You could also say that, the other night, my daughter and I watched Mean Girls, Regina George. It's debatable whether or not she's an evil character, but, she is definitely that conflict creator, in that story. So you may have not necessarily a good and evil aspect or a good guy, bad guy aspect. It just may be people who just don't agree or personalities that just simply clash. Inanimate forces. Sometimes the antagonist isn't a person at all. It's some external force, force of nature. A lot of your disaster movies can be seen as, whatever the cataclysm is, that's your, antagonist. You can think of the movie Jaws, in which, the shark is the antagonist. So I always say, like the movie The Perfect Storm, like that storm is the antagonist of the story. That's the bad guy of that story. And then the fourth type of an antagonist is the protagonist as the antagonist. So I think, having an inner turmoil that, the main character, the protagonist of the story is their own worst enemy. So they cause their own, problems. They kind of a self-sabotage. They can, through either inner conflicts, flaws, personal struggles, this can be a really diverse and complex narrative, in which a character battles their own demons. But it can be a really interesting book to read or write. One example, I think the most classic example is, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, these two entities that live within the same person. You could even go a step further into modern day. I don't know if anybody's watched the movie Split, where he has multiple personalities. That character, very compelling, very interesting. And, some of them are good into personalities and some of them are bad. Same with, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. You have kind of good and evil in one person. So it causes a lot of conflict. So those are the basic types of antagonists. So whenever you're reading a book, watching a movie, try to, define what kind of protagonist and what kind of antagonist that you're dealing with and see what kind of mixtures. It may be more than one. I mean, you can have a villain character and also have inanimate forces, or you can have a conflict creator and also have, a protagonist being their own worst enemy. You can have multiple sources of conflict. There needs to be one more predominant than the other to, have a clear, concise point to the narrative. But, you can always kind of spice it up a little bit and use multiples, but at least know which category that they fall in helps you to kind of keep it on track.